How does the West view India? A place where there is economic opportunities, or it's a place that is just an alternative to China for the time being?
I mean, the West is going through a moment of being very pro-India. India is having a moment of economic excitement.
Investors in the West, when they look at India, they're going to see a different India today than they would have back in 2011.
I think so. I mean, I think you can look at the type of reforms that have been introduced under Prime Minister Modi and say some fairly simple things. Those that have involved digital technology have been very successful generally. The West wants to be a partner with India for reasons that are nothing to do with India. I mean, they want to be a partner with India because it's good for us, I'll say us for the West, because we're worried about China. The fact that India has a large population won't help it very much unless it introduces the kind of structural economic reforms which allow countries to grow.
Researchers and people who are talking about China overtaking US in the coming time. So what do you think are these strategic interests for China?
There's a debate within China about the type of great power that it will become.
China and India, two Asian giants that are talked about a lot as competitors, but sometimes you see them cooperating, especially in multilateral institutions. And yet right now, as US and China relations get strained, where are the areas in which opportunities lie for India? And other than that, speculations about China's growth story suddenly turning into a bubble that has burst already is doing the rounds. How much truth is there that China's growth story is over and it is India's turn now? To talk about this, I have with me James Crabtree. James has been the Financial Times Mumbai bureau chief from 2011 to 2016. He's a geopolitical analyst with a keen interest in India and China. Right now at this juncture where the US-China relations are a bit strained and India is looking for all these opportunities, how does the West view India? A place where there is economic opportunities, or it's a place that is just an alternative to China for the time being?
I mean, the West is going through a moment of being very pro-India. India is having a moment of economic excitement. So the Indian economy is growing quickly. Lots of investors have decided that they're going to take money out of China and put it into India. And then there's a geopolitical piece to this, which is that as the West has become more nervous about the rise of China, so India has also become nervous about the rise of China, and your enemy's enemy is your friend. And so that has pushed America, Europe, and India closer together. And so, yes, at the moment, there's a lot of excitement about India's future potential.
As a competitor for leadership of the developing countries, because both India and China see themselves in those roles, how do you see it panning out that AIIB or NDB and all these multilateral institutions which are currently providing development financing, and you see a little bit of India-China tensions even within these institutions. So do you see that getting worse as time passes, or do you think like if US-China can work on their relationship, then these things will also tend to get better?
I think India and China are almost predestined to compete with one another, because you look at the map, you have these two very big growing countries with only the Himalayas in between them, and I think it's natural that they will be rivals. That doesn't necessarily mean it'll happen in the same way for the next 100 years, but you're right that at the moment one of the things that is happening in the world is that both India and China aspire to be the leader of the global South. And they do this in different ways. So as you said, China often provides money, it has multilateral institutions. India seeks leadership in a different way. One of the ways it did that was with the G20 last year. And I think you'll continue to see both of these countries trying to say that they are the sort of the legitimate leader and champion of the interests of the emerging economies, because if they do that, then that makes them more powerful.
China has an aging population, whereas in the coming years, India is supposed to have like a working populations that are going to outgrow China, and there is immense potential. But then there are some economists who say that India has had this immense potential for years and yet hasn't been able to make the kind of economic growth that China did.
Well, I mean, you summarize the issue quite nicely. So at the moment, India and China have roughly the same population, about 1.3, 1.4 billion people. By the middle of this century, China's will be heading towards half that level, and India's will be, some hundreds of billions larger. I'm not sure that, demography is complete destiny. the fact that India has a large population won't help it very much unless it introduces the kind of structural economic reforms which allow countries to grow. China could still be a very powerful country if its population declined, but it got a lot richer. So really, rather than focusing on the population, I would focus on the sort of the nature of the reform process that will make your economy efficient.
You were there in India from 2011 to 2016. What kind of structural changes did you see during that period? Because 2014 is when Narendra Modi came to power, and he brought with him a lot of reforms. And even today, there's a lot of effort being made about digitization and ensuring that ease of doing business gets better and better in India. Do you think that for investors in the West, when they look at India, they're going to see a different India today than they would have back in 2011?
I think so. I mean, I think you can look at the type of reforms that have been introduced under Prime Minister Modi and say some fairly simple things. Those that have involved digital technology have been very successful generally. So that's anything from the biometric ID databases through to 5G. Things that have involved physical infrastructure have been pretty successful. The roads, the railways, they're better than they were. They're not as good as China, and there's a long journey to go, but they're getting better. Things that have involved human capital, that is, skilling people, have generally not been very good. And so that's a big challenge for India, that you have tens of millions of people leaving agriculture and trying to move to cities, and they want jobs. And in order to have jobs, then they need to have skills. And so that is a real challenge, that India's current economic model finds it hard to develop good human capital, except at the very high end. This is a country that produces a lot of engineers and technologists, but what it doesn't produce a lot of is good quality nurses and teachers and people who could work in retail stores, for instance. And so that's a challenge. You can't become rich unless you have a good stock of human capital. So
in China, you have the country focusing on initially property and then now manufacturing. But then in India, you see shifts being made to directly the service sector. Do you think that's the right approach? And even now, the gig economy, there are a lot of questions about the gig economy, it's a bubble waiting to burst, and just focusing on the service sector is not going to be enough. What's your opinion on that?
So India has had a long-running problem with insufficient manufacturing. Most countries that have got rich have done so by going through a phase of export-led manufacturing growth. And India, 5 or 10 years ago, 15% of GDP was in manufacturing, and now it's probably about the same. So, India would ideally grow its manufacturing sector, and that is what the government is trying to do in fits and starts with the Make in India campaign, and that means getting companies like Apple to assemble and eventually make iPhones and other types of electronics in India. But I don't think India is ever going to be able to, nor necessarily would it want to, mimic the extraordinarily industrial growth path that China has been on, not least because of the climate potential of that. And therefore, India is going to have to develop its own mix, some of which will be about growth coming from serving the internal market, some of which will be about services, and some of which will be about a greater manufacturing sector, particularly export manufacturing, but just not in the same way that China did it.
If you talk about foreign policy and diplomacy, do you see that China is currently struggling in the international world to be able to convince people of its intentions in the future, whereas India has had its own path chartered, making sure that we have better relations with multiple different countries that West has a problem with is not an issue?
Well, I think it's a sort of balance, right, where the West wants to be a partner with India for reasons that are nothing to do with India. They want to be a partner with India because it's good for us, I'll say us for the West, because we're worried about China. But the question is, to what extent do the interests overlap? So there are some things that India has done that the West doesn't like. So it doesn't like the fact that India wasn't very supportive of Ukraine. It doesn't like the fact that India was assassinating people in Canada. And the question is, well, are the things that India are doing, when you weigh up the balance, there's the plus side of having a strong relationship with India, and then there's some negatives, and where does it come out? And at the moment, it comes out pretty positively. I don't want to say that India has a get-out-of-jail-free card, but it's clear that, as in any relationship, India can do some things that its partners don't like, and that doesn't mean that the partnership is over. It just means you have to talk about that and agree to disagree and focus on the things that you want to do together that are more positive.
Do you think that India is still making use of its non-aligned policy, in which it's still part of the Quad, but it's also part of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And it's creating that image, oh, this has been our history, this has been our lineage, we've always been non-aligned, and that is the path we're moving forward with, or it's something else.
India is no longer anything remotely close to a non-aligned power. I understand completely why, it makes perfect sense that India should have, will want to have relations with as many powers as possible. And so it will have useful things that it wants to do with the United Arab Emirates or Turkey or Israel. But at the nub of this is about, rising geopolitical competition. And, in that battle, India has picked a side, and it has decided that it is more worried about China than in anything else, and therefore it is going to develop, whatever else it does, it's going to develop much closer relationships with the other countries that are very worried about China. And those countries are the United States, Japan, Australia, the Philippines, the European countries, and a few others. And I think that's a very clear trend in Indian foreign policy over the last few years. Now, that doesn't mean that they're going to entirely throw Russia under the bus, or suddenly support Ukraine just because the Europeans want them to. That's not the kind of country that India is, and that's not perceived what India perceives to be in its own national interest. But the idea that India is non-aligned in the kind of the big geopolitical contest of the age is just not true.
Various countries are right now trying for friendshoring instead of depending on cheap manufactured goods. And how do you see that, on one hand, China dominates the supply chains in the energy sector, on the other hand, other countries like India are trying to catch up, whether it is in form of like solar power or other efforts. Do you think countries would be able to shift from China to another alternate when it comes to energy sector, at least with the manufacturing of cheap EVs, with solar power?
India very much hopes that this will happen. So there are companies that are, at the very least, if they're not leaving China, then they're no longer investing in China and they're investing in somewhere else. And so, you have this list of countries that people invest in: Mexico, Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia. And India is one of those countries. I suppose the question is, some of this business will come India's way almost naturally because people are looking for growth markets, and they also need somewhere else to make things. The question, I think, is how much of it can come India's way and how quickly. That's what remains to be seen. And that comes down to a question that's partly how big is the push factor, how quickly do people want or need to get out of China, but also how good is the pull factor, how good is the Indian ecosystem. At the moment, sad to say, you can't make electronics in India the way that you can make them in China. You can't make them anywhere else the way you can make them in China. So over time, India has to develop these ecosystems that mean that India isn't just theoretically a better place to make these things, it's actually a better place to make these things.
And China talks a lot about sustainable global development, and where it's trying to make these investments into developing countries to ensure that the infrastructure gap that exists in these countries is fulfilled. And it's trying to create this image of being the big brother that's trying to step in where the West hasn't been able to. How do you think that's working out for China?
I think that China has had quite a successful strategy appealing to the global South, and it will continue to do that. If you look only in the last few days here in Beijing, where we're sitting, you've had Prabowo, who's the new Indonesian president, coming into office later this year. Relatively recently, you've had Anwar Ibrahim, Lula of Brazil. So China is reaching out intensively to leaders from the kind of emerging world. And I think it's a very sensible strategy for China to do this. The question is, will that ultimately achieve their objectives? That's not clear, but I think they have been quite successful at presenting themselves as an alternative to the West, particularly in areas that China is good at, like hard infrastructure, and I think they will continue to do that.
And in parts of the multilateral organizations that China is a part of, if you talk about BRICS, and recently with the BRICS expansion, do you think these are areas in which China will be able to create its own kind of hegemony? Or do you think these loosely based organizations that exist today have the countries have their own interests, and it's not necessarily a domain in which China will be able to grow diplomatically?
Yeah, I don't think China is going to become a sort of dominant hegemonic power in these institutions. Even if you look at the ones you talked about, the BRICS, It was 5 countries, it's now expanded to 8 or 9, so it's become more diffuse, it's more difficult to control. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization is already quite difficult to control, and it's got India within it, so India has a veto of a sort. So I don't think really China aims to do that. I mean, I think China sees these institutions as a way of creating an alternative set of rules that and relationships that are in China's strategic interest. So I think it thinks it's useful to have these organizations, but it doesn't it doesn't run them entirely on its own as a sort of fiefdom.
But what could be those strategic interests? Because people here in China mention it repeatedly that they have no intentions of becoming a superpower like US. But on the other hand, you still have researchers and people who are talking about China overtaking US in the coming time. So what do you think are these strategic interests for China?
Well, I think there can be 2 things that are true, right? There's a debate within China about the type of great power that it will become. And so some people do say that. They say, well, we have limited aims, we want to live in peace. And then there are others who say the opposite. They say, well, we would like to be the same kind of power that the United States is, which means a very large military, bases all over the world. So that debate continues within China. I think that, however, there's a sort of another way you can understand this, which is that the process of becoming a great power then creates these demands anyway. So, you used to be a smaller country, but now you've got, you need to have all of these resources. So you've got to create all these relationships with countries in Africa and the Middle East. And the bigger you become, the larger your sense of your strategic self-interest becomes. And then you then have to police that self-interest. So there's a process that happens almost accidentally as countries, particularly big countries, get bigger and more powerful, that they suddenly discover that more things are strategically important for them, and therefore they have to defend these interests. And so they then become more expansionist almost by accident.
Thank you so much for this informational session, James.
Thank you for having me.
So you heard James Crabtree. He believes that India does have the potential. The only thing that's yet to be seen is what kind of structural changes could happen to make sure that it is even more attractive to the Western investors than it is right now. And for the countries that are trying to find alternatives to China, India does seem as an appealing option. But would that be the case maybe 10, 15 years from now? That is yet to be seen.